In this episode, we explore how the lack of a clear and shared definition of inclusion contributes to the exclusion of autistic children from mainstream schools in Pakistan. Without a unified understanding of what true inclusion looks like, schools struggle to implement consistent practices that support autistic learners. This ambiguity creates confusion for educators, families, and policymakers, making it harder to provide the necessary accommodations and resources. As a result, many autistic children are left without access to quality education, reinforcing their marginalization in the early years of schooling.
As a therapist and educationist, I have been exploring the realities of autistic children's inclusion in early years education of Pakistan for over a decade now. And I've come to realize that one of the biggest obstacles faced is the lack of a clear definition of inclusion and what it truly means. Schools often claim to be inclusive, but without a clear understanding of what that entails, the schools typically do not have a fully inclusive system in place. I remember visiting a school in Pakistan that proudly claimed that it was inclusive, welcoming autistic children and students with diverse needs into their classrooms. But when I walked into that school and into the classrooms, what I saw was extremely disheartening. An autistic child was seated at the far corner of the class, isolated from the rest of the classroom, sitting by himself in the corner. He was completely removed from the actual learning environment. The teachers, however, believed that having the autistic child in the classroom in proximity of the neurotypical kids was inclusion. However, there was no engagement, there was no effort on the part of the teachers to include the autistic child in the activities of the classroom. This was not inclusion. This was performative inclusion. What does that mean? This means that the school was just creating an illusion of inclusion, but inclusion in its true sense was actually not happening in the classroom environment. It struck me as how, in the minds of many schools in Pakistan, the idea of inclusion stops at the mere physical presence of an autistic child in the classroom, while the emotional, social, and cognitive needs of the child are completely ignored. This incomplete understanding of inclusion is a huge barrier for the inclusion of autistic children in early years education settings of Pakistan. Because without addressing their core needs, we're not actually giving them a chance at true inclusion. True inclusion, as we will discuss in this episode, is much more than placing an autistic child physically in a classroom setting. It's so much more than this. It's about creating an environment where every child feels like they belong. Every child is given a sense of purpose. Every child is given the opportunity to learn, feel included, and grow. This experience that I had really deepened my understanding of the need to actually define inclusion and help create an inclusive education system in Pakistan. I will begin with a broader global perspective before narrowing in and focusing on Pakistan in particular. By examining the various definitions and understandings of inclusion, I aim to underscore the challenges and complexities which arise due to these varying definitions of inclusion. I begin this literature review by reviewing Forlin et al.'s Review of the Inclusive Education of Students with Disabilities, a review of the best evidence in relation to theory and practice. In this review, they asserted that the term inclusion and inclusive education is contentious, largely due to its lack of a clear definition and a lack of a focused definition. And this ambiguity often leads to a lack of clear implementation of inclusion in classroom settings. This ambiguity often complicates efforts to measure inclusive education and inclusion in education settings, given that its definitions assume static commonalities, despite being shaped by evolving educational practices, contexts, and cultures. Furthermore, the article highlighted that the vague definition of inclusion can actually be used for exploitation for political purposes, allowing educators to align their education system, calling it inclusive or naming it as inclusion without actually promoting inclusive education. In 2018, the Global Education Monitoring Report, published by UNESCO, also highlighted this matter, drawing attention to this critical issue of inconsistent definitions of inclusion, noting that at times inclusion is too vaguely defined, resulting in poor implementation of actual inclusion. while in other instances it is defined too narrowly, which also results in the exclusion of certain groups. However, their own definition, which states that inclusive education aims to ensure inclusive education and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning, is also ambiguous. The 2018 Global Education Monitoring Report also stated the need for a clear definition of inclusive education that explicitly addresses ableism. Ableism is the discrimination and prejudice against individuals with disabilities. This is also a central issue which needs to be addressed. The authors argued that ableism is embedded not only in the physical location of where students with disabilities are educated, but also in the broader conceptualization, language, and practices of special education itself. In other words, the focus should not just be on where education happens, but on how ableist attitudes and practices are deeply ingrained within the education system, affecting in the end how inclusion is understood and actually implemented. The findings of this report are also supported by more recent research conducted by Francisco et al., which indicates that the absence of a clear definition of inclusion is a fundamental issue that contributes to the phenomena of exclusion. Thus, it can be drawn that the problem of a lack of a clear definition of inclusion is in fact a global phenomena and is not just limited to Pakistan. Now that we have explored the global literature on the challenges surrounding the definition of inclusion, we will narrow our focus to countries similar to Pakistan. And then we will eventually look at the definition of inclusion within the context of Pakistan itself. Overall, the literature reviewed in this section will also highlight how the lack of a clear definition of inclusion is contributing to the exclusion of autistic children in other developing countries around the world. In 2018, Price emphasized in inclusive and special education approaches in developing countries how a lack of clarity in defining inclusive education across developing nations also presents challenges to ensuring inclusive education for all children. Price further highlighted that despite the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which calls for inclusive education under the Sustainable Development Goal 5, there remains no universally acceptable definition of what inclusive education or inclusion truly entails. Some organizations and countries adopt a more broader perspective, viewing inclusion as encompassing all marginalized groups. The European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, for instance, offered an overview of how this concept is presented in the academic literature and international works. In their 2018 article, they specifically discussed Ethiopia to demonstrate how varying definitions of inclusive education can exist in one country, leading to different interpretations in both policy and actual implementation. The authors noted that in Ethiopia, there are many varying definitions of inclusive education and inclusion. This led to different interpretations in both policy and implementation, causing confusion and inconsistencies in actual implementation across educational institutions. Again, there is a misconception that simply physically placing students with diverse needs in a classroom constitutes as inclusion or as inclusive education. The article also emphasized that without necessary adjustments in Ethiopia, they are merely working towards integration and not towards true inclusion. The article further highlighted that for true inclusive education to take place, systemic changes are required and not just merely placing autistic children in the classroom. In Ethiopia, the conditions for creating truly inclusive classrooms have not yet been created, indicating that there is a gap between the definition and the actual implementation of inclusive education. Having discussed the broader issue of the lack of definition of inclusion in a country similar to Pakistan, now let's narrow our focus to Pakistan. Let's now examine and discuss how the lack of a clear definition of inclusion in Pakistan is acting as a barrier to the true inclusion of autistic children in Pakistan. In their 2015 article, Sharma and colleagues noted that to this date, there is no true and clear definition of inclusive education or inclusion in Pakistan. They further described anecdotal evidence suggesting that to date in Pakistan, the concept of inclusion is merely that of placing a child physically in the classroom setting without actually integrating the child into the classroom. Building on this, The background paper for the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report highlighted a significant gap in Pakistan's inclusive education, namely the absence of a clear and concise definition of inclusive education. Three types of definitions of inclusive education are given in this report. First, it describes inclusive education as a transition from traditional special education models such as integration and mainstreaming to a more inclusive approach that aims to integrate children with disabilities into mainstream classrooms. Second, the report describes the 2002 National Policy for Persons with Disabilities, which envisions inclusive education as creating an environment that allows individuals with disabilities to reach their full potential through mainstreaming. Third and lastly, the report highlighted how, according to the Islamabad Declaration on Inclusive Education, all children, regardless of gender, ethnicity, culture, religion, or disability, are to be treated equally and are to be given equal rights. The report used these examples to highlight how the lack of a clear and concise definition of inclusion is acting as a barrier to true inclusion in Pakistan. Inclusive education is also not well defined within Pakistan's constitution, laws, or federal and provincial policies and plans. The Constitution of Pakistan does not provide an explicit or specific definition of inclusive education. However, it does provide certain principles that do align with it. For instance, Article 25 of the Constitution ensures equality for all citizens, which does resonate with the principles of inclusive education. The laws and policies in Pakistan, however, do not provide a clear and concise definition of inclusive education. While some documents do refer to inclusive education, they refer to it in an indirect manner, without actually detailing what the terms inclusive or inclusive education truly mean. Because of this lack of clarity in the definition of inclusive education, vulnerable groups and autistic children are at risk of exclusion from mainstream education settings. This ambiguity around the definition of inclusive education and inclusion not only puts autistic children at risk of being excluded, but also creates ambiguity and uncertainty in the minds of educators. Teachers often find themselves unsure or confused about what inclusive education truly means and how they are to integrate autistic children into the classroom setting. This point was further highlighted by Ehsan in his article in 2018. Ehsan interviewed 10 teachers and 10 students from urban areas and 8 teachers and 7 students from rural areas, making it a total of 35 participants that were interviewed. Overall, this study employed a comprehensive thematic coding approach, supported by memoing, transcription, and sorting, to analyze the qualitative data collected from the interviews. This method allowed the researchers to identify and collect the key themes related to inclusive education in Pakistan. The data analysis showed that the teachers often feel uncertain about what inclusive education entails and means. One educator interviewed explicitly stated that teachers need to be made certain and assured of what inclusive education truly means for them to be able to implement it in their classrooms. Ehsan's study clearly indicates how this confusion among educators results in the misconception about students with disabilities. This in turn negatively affects teachers' attitudes and self-efficacy, which is their belief in themselves to be able to integrate autistic children into the classroom setting. Without a shared, clear understanding of inclusion, teachers face challenges in implementing inclusive education practices, ultimately hindering progress towards educational inclusivity. If teachers have difficulty implementing inclusive education in their classrooms, then entire schools will face difficulty in implementing truly inclusive practices.
In conclusion, the literature review clearly indicates that the absence of a precise definition of inclusion poses a substantial barrier to the implementation of inclusive education in Pakistan. This systematic limitation is evident in educational strategies that fail to consider the diverse needs of all vulnerable groups, regardless of their unique learning challenges. Therefore, it can be concluded that without a universally accepted and non-restrictive definition of inclusion, barriers to achieving true inclusivity in education will persist. Addressing this definitional gap is crucial for developing effective policies and practices that foster an inclusive educational environment for all learners.